The sun had barely begun to rise over the vast Texas plains, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth. The wind swept across the land, stirring the sparse grasses and carrying with it the scent of dust and sweat. Caleb Thornfield stood at the edge of his ranch, his broad shoulders hunched against the weight of the morning, the sound of distant hooves already filling the silence. In the distance, the silhouette of a lone rider cut through the golden light, but it wasn't the rider that had his attention. It was the smoke. He squinted into the horizon, eyes narrowing as the distant column of smoke rose like a marker of death. He knew what it meant. It wasn't the first time he'd seen smoke rise in these parts. Indian raids, banditry, and the occasional government soldier. Life in the West was full of violent interruptions. But this smoke, there was something about it. Something different. Caleb felt the tightness in his chest, the quickening of his heartbeat as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something ain't right, he muttered to himself, glancing back at his ranch. The land was quiet, too quiet. His cattle were grazing lazily near Willow Creek, their low murmurs the only sound in the still morning. The barn, where he kept the few supplies he had left, stood like a lone sentinel. Behind it was the small cabin that had been his home for the past 3 years. His wife, Sarah, had once called it a home full of love. Now, it was just a place where memories were buried in the floorboards. He turned toward his horse, the leather reins cold under his touch. He had lost so much in the last few years, his wife, his peace of mind, his sense of safety in this unforgiving land. But one thing Caleb Thornfield had never lost was his gut instinct. And his gut was telling him to go to that smoke. It was calling to him, a whisper in the back of his mind. Better to be stupid than dead, he whispered as he mounted his horse. The decision was made, and the path was set. As he rode out, the wind picked up, brushing against his face like a harsh reminder of the price one paid for living in this desolate world. He urged his horse faster, knowing the terrain well enough to keep a steady pace without risking a misstep. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows shortened. It would be another brutally hot day in the Texas wilderness, but Caleb Thornfield wasn't concerned about the heat. His focus was fixed on the smoke ahead. By the time he reached the clearing near Willow Creek, the smoke was thick in the air, its acrid bite sharp on the wind. He dismounted quickly, eyes scanning the landscape, his rifle slung across his back. The sound of gunshots echoed in the distance, distant yet clear, a cry for help, maybe, or the crack of violence that had been left unchecked too long. What he found was nothing he could have prepared for. A young Comanche girl lay sprawled behind a fallen cottonwood tree, her body a twisted, bloody mess. Caleb's heart clenched at the sight. Her clothes, once a proud display of her tribe, were soaked in blood, the bright red of it stark against the earth. Her breathing came in ragged, painful gasps. She couldn't be older than 16, her dark eyes wide with pain, yet there was no fear in them, only defiance. Caleb's hand twitched toward his rifle, instinctively ready to defend himself. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders had attacked his neighbors, had taken his wife, Sarah, in a raid that left nothing but ash in its wake. The smart thing would be to leave her here, let her die, and avoid any further trouble. His mind, the cold, calculating part of him, told him to ride away and pretend like nothing had happened. But the girl's eyes, they reminded him of Sarah's, not in appearance, but in the refusal to surrender. His decision felt like a weight pressing down on him as he dismounted, slowly and cautiously, hands visible. The girl tried to crawl away, her movements weak, leaving a crimson trail on the dry earth. Caleb was torn. Every ounce of him screamed to leave, to save himself. But something inside him, something human, something he'd buried deep after Sarah's death, drove him forward. He didn't understand why, but he knew he couldn't leave her. She was alive. He knelt beside her, reaching out with steady hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice rough from the dry air. She flinched, the struggle visible in her eyes, but she didn't pull away. "I won't hurt you," Caleb repeated. He was a man who knew pain, who had seen the worst of the world, but he had never before known the weight of this choice. To save her meant he would be making himself a target. To save her meant more than just a man's compassion. He scooped her into his arms, feeling the weight of her thin body, the strength that was almost gone from her frame. For a moment, he thought she might fight him, but she didn't. She let him carry her, as though her life depended on it. The ride back to his ranch felt like an eternity. Every shadow on the horizon could be a Comanche war party. Every sound could be the hoofbeats of soldiers on the hunt. Caleb didn't know how far they were from the raiders, or if they were already being hunted, but the girl's life depended on him. And for once in his life, Caleb Thornfield was making a choice that wasn't about running or hiding. It was about standing his ground. When they finally reached his ranch, the barn was a sanctuary in the midst of an uncertain world. The sun had set, and Caleb's heart hammered in his chest as he carried the girl into the barn, laying her on the fresh hay. His mind raced as he gathered his supplies. He didn't have much, just a knife and a small fire to heat it with. But it would have to do. The girl's eyes fluttered open for a moment, wide with confusion and terror, as though she couldn't understand why a white man was helping her. He could feel her hesitation, her mistrust. But there was no time to explain. The bullet had to come out, or she would die. With trembling hands, Caleb prepared for the crude surgery that would either save her life or seal her fate. She bit down on a leather strap to muffle her screams as he worked, the sound of her pain filling the barn like the echoes of everything he had lost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bleeding stopped. She passed out from the pain and exhaustion, her small body lying still on the hay. Caleb sat back on his heels, sweat dripping from his brow. He had saved her, but he knew that the cost of this decision would be far higher than anything he had ever faced before, and the consequences were already riding toward him. The morning came quickly, dragging its weight like a gunfight at dawn. Caleb awoke to the faint sound of the wind whipping through the cracks of the barn, carrying with it the scent of earth and dust. The girl was still unconscious, her fever raging, but at least she was alive. For the moment, that was enough. Caleb had done what he could, but the coming hours, days perhaps, would be the real test. The sun was barely over the horizon when Caleb heard it, the low, rhythmic thrum of war drums. The unmistakable sound, a sound that sent a chill down his spine, reverberated through the land, growing louder with every beat. His heart sank. He stepped outside the barn, squinting against the bright morning light. What he saw made his blood run cold. 50 Comanche warriors on horseback, painted for battle, surrounded his ranch. The war paint on their faces was vivid, gleaming in the morning light. They were a sea of fire and fury, their horses restless, their eyes locked onto the small cabin, the barn, the house he had worked so hard to build. The chief, a tall, imposing figure with gray streaks in his hair, sat astride a powerful stallion, his weathered face set in stone, staring at Caleb's ranch with a fury that Caleb had no way of understanding. The old man's gaze was cold, like the edge of a tomahawk, yet Caleb could see the flicker of something else in those eyes, something personal. The chief's daughter, Ayanna, had been wounded, saved, and now Caleb had become the center of this storm. A twinge of guilt twisted in Caleb's chest as he realized the weight of what he'd done. Saving Ayanna had made him a target, not just for the Comanche, but for a war that Caleb never wanted to fight. His own people would see him as a traitor, a sympathizer to the enemy. And now, the very people he'd helped were surrounding his land with an army of warriors. As he turned back to the barn, the girl stirred. Her fevered breaths were shallow, and her eyes fluttered open, the confusion in them sharp. She tried to speak, but the words came out in rapid Comanche, too fast for Caleb to understand. He didn't need to. Her meaning was clear. She was calling for her father. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a conflict, a choice, and it was going to cost him. The chief's warriors weren't here to negotiate. They were here for the girl, and the price for saving her was higher than Caleb had ever imagined. The girl struggled to sit up, wincing from the pain of her shoulder, her hand pressed tightly against the wound. She looked at Caleb, her face a mask of fear and gratitude. It was clear now, she didn't trust him. She couldn't. She was a prisoner of her own fate, caught between two worlds that hated each other. Caleb heard the chief's voice then, booming across the silence, his tone harsh and foreign. "White man, you have what belongs to us." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. How could he explain this? How could he tell them that he wasn't holding Ayanna as a prisoner, that he wasn't their enemy? The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating him. He couldn't speak their language, but he knew their gaze, the suspicion, the rage, the determination. They saw him as nothing more than another settler who had taken from them, another thief who had stolen their people's future. But Caleb didn't have time to explain. The warriors were closing in, their horses shifting restlessly beneath them. The chief raised his hand, and suddenly the circle of warriors tightened. Caleb's heart pounded as the realization sank in. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded. He stepped out of the barn slowly, his hands raised to show that he meant no harm. He had no weapon on him, nothing to defend himself with. He stood there in the open, a lone man against a sea of warriors, a beacon for all of them to focus their rage. "She's alive," Caleb called out, his voice steady but his heart in his throat. "Your daughter is alive, but she's hurt badly." The chief's eyes narrowed, and Caleb could see the doubt flicker in them. The chief didn't trust him, not yet. And Caleb knew that what he said next would decide his fate. "She'll die if you don't help her," Caleb added, his voice strong, even though his legs were trembling beneath him. The chief's expression was unreadable, but his warriors shifted in their saddles, the tension rising like a storm. Caleb could see it in their eyes, the hunger for vengeance. They weren't here to talk. They were here for a fight. Ayanna's voice came then, weak but determined. "He saved me," she said in Comanche, her words clear, her tone full of pain. Her father's eyes widened at her words, and for a moment, the entire war party seemed to pause. It was a split second of hesitation, a single moment where Caleb thought, just maybe, he'd made a difference. But then, as quickly as the hesitation came, it was gone. The lieutenant, a young warrior with fresh scars on his face, dismounted from his horse and moved toward Caleb. His eyes were filled with hatred, his face a twisted mask of rage. "You take her," the lieutenant said in broken English. "You die. All white men die." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He was being marked for death, not just by the Comanche, but by his own kind. This wasn't just about Ayanna anymore. This was about something deeper, a betrayal, a thirst for revenge that went back long before today. As Caleb's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, the chief called out, his voice low but full of authority. "You choose to fight for her, white man." Caleb hesitated. He had already given so much of himself to this fight, so much more than he ever thought he would. His wife, his peace, his land. But he had never been a man to run, to turn away from something that was right. "I choose to fight for what's right," Caleb said, the words coming out before he even realized they were true. His decision was made, and there was no turning back now. The wind had picked up by the time the Comanche began to circle. Caleb stood firm, his rifle in his hands, his gaze locked on the chief and his warriors. They were not looking for cattle or land. They were looking for blood. Caleb's land had become a battleground, a place where vengeance and justice would collide. His mind raced as the familiar smell of gunpowder began to fill the air, the distant thrum of hooves on the hard earth echoing in his ears. He had made his choice, and now there was no going back. He could already feel the weight of his decision settling into his bones. Behind him, the sound of footsteps echoed as the ranchers, Pete Murdoch and the others, moved in behind him. They had seen what Caleb had done, what he was about to face, and despite the odds, they were with him. These are men who knew hard work, who knew what it meant to stand up for what was right. And now, with their weapons in hand, they were ready to fight alongside him. The chief signaled his warriors with a raised hand. The tension was palpable. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Caleb knew the battle would begin soon, but he wasn't prepared for how quickly it would escalate. The lieutenant, his face a mask of fury, raised his rifle and aimed at Caleb. Caleb's eyes flicked to Iona, still crouched by the water trough, her father standing guard over her. Despite her pain, she was watching him closely, her gaze steady, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Caleb wasn't sure whether she was expecting him to make a stand or expecting him to fail. "Don't let them take her," Iona whispered, her voice strained. She had seen too much loss, too much violence in her short life to trust easily. But Caleb's actions had earned her trust, and that, in itself, felt like a victory. The lieutenant's finger was tightening on the trigger when a sharp, high-pitched whistle cut through the air. Caleb's heart skipped. It wasn't a soldier's whistle. It wasn't the call of the Comanche. It was something else. The ranchers, those men who had come to his side, immediately reacted. Without hesitation, Pete Murdoch raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, loud and defiant, and Caleb's heart leapt. Pete's shot hit the lieutenant's horse, causing the animal to rear back in pain. The young warrior barely managed to stay on his feet as the horse bolted, knocking him off his balance. It was chaos. The Comanche warriors, seeing their lieutenant thrown from his mount, reacted instantly, charging forward with the speed of lightning. Arrows flew, finding their marks in the wood and the earth, while gunfire from the ranchers rang out in rapid succession. Caleb moved quickly, firing with precision, each shot echoing in his ears as it rang true. But the Comanche had already begun to scatter, disappearing into the wind like ghosts. They were fierce, yes, but they were not blind. The cavalry, too, had begun to react. Their horses clattered against the ground, and their officers shouted orders, trying to regain control of their men. But Caleb knew it was too late. There was no stopping this now. It was a fight to the death, and it was no longer about saving a life. It was about survival. As the Comanche warriors closed in, Caleb heard the familiar sound of arrows hitting the earth. One arrow slammed into the side of his barn, splintering the wood. Another whizzed past him, embedding itself deep into the post beside his front porch. With a swift motion, Caleb dropped to one knee, steadying his rifle. He knew this moment could be his last, but he would go out with honor. The wind howled around him as he took aim, his heart pounding in his chest. The chief was leading the charge, and Caleb knew the time had come for him to make his choice, fight or die. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and a warrior fell from his horse, a clean hit to the chest. Caleb didn't pause to watch him hit the ground. He moved again, faster now, taking aim at the next rider. Another shot, another fallen warrior. The chaos surrounding him intensified. He could feel the heat of the sun on his neck, the sting of sweat in his eyes, but his focus never wavered. The sound of hooves continued to ring through the air, but the cavalry had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the Comanche, and now they were paying for it. The Comanche were not just warriors, they were survivors. The ranch became a fortress as the battle raged on. Horses screamed, arrows flew, and the sound of gunfire filled the air like thunder. But then, a deafening silence. Caleb's heart beat in his ears as he looked across the battlefield. The warriors were scattering now, retreating back into the cover of the land, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The cavalry, too, was in disarray, their numbers thinning rapidly as more and more soldiers fell. Caleb's chest heaved with exhaustion, his hands slick with sweat as he lowered his rifle. He had survived this battle, but the cost was steep. He turned to see the chief, his face stern, his warriors circling back behind him. For a moment, everything seemed to stop, as if the world was waiting to see what would happen next. And then, the chief did something Caleb didn't expect. He lowered his weapon and nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement of the fight they had just shared. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he met the chief's eyes, understanding passing between them. They had both chosen this moment, and it had cost them everything. But in that cost, there was something more: respect. The chief gave one final command in Comanche, and the remaining warriors began to pull back, retreating into the wilderness, leaving the battlefield behind. The cavalry, their morale broken, retreated as well. Caleb knew this battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The dust from the battle settled slowly over Caleb's ranch, the sound of hooves and gunfire still ringing in his ears. His chest rose and fell with the weight of what had just transpired. His clothes were stained with sweat and dirt, his hands trembling from the raw, exhausting violence of it all. But amidst the devastation, something else had changed, the very landscape of his life. Caleb stood outside his cabin, staring at the smoldering remains of the field, where the bodies of the dead soldiers lay scattered like broken dolls in the grass. The ranch, once a peaceful place where he had toiled for years, had now become a place of conflict and bloodshed. He had saved a girl, yes, but at what cost? The dead soldiers, the wounded warriors, the risk to his own life. It had all culminated in one singular, inescapable truth. Caleb Thornfield's life had been irrevocably altered. But it wasn't just the land he'd lost. It was his identity, his sense of peace, and most painfully, his connection to the very land that had once been his sanctuary. Sarah's absence had already haunted him every day, but now there was something else to reckon with: guilt, fear, and the weight of the decisions he had made in the heat of battle. His eyes drifted toward the small cabin where Ayanna was resting, her fever broken, her breathing steadier now, but still fragile. She was no longer the terrified girl he had found in the cottonwood grove. She was someone else, someone whose life he had saved, yes, but whose presence now felt like a reminder of the choices he had made. The chief had left a short while ago, after the battle, with his warriors. But Ayanna's fate had not been sealed just yet. She had insisted on staying with Caleb until she was fully healed, as per the Comanche custom. He hadn't expected that. She could have returned to her people, could have hidden herself away from the danger that still lingered. But instead, she had chosen to stay here with him. The sound of horses' hooves grew nearer. Caleb looked up to see Pete Murdoch and the other ranchers arriving, their expressions serious, their horses lathered from a long ride. They'd come to see the aftermath of the bloodshed, and likely to decide whether or not they would continue to stand by him after everything that had happened. Pete Murdoch, the oldest of the group, dismounted with a grunt. He was a rough man, weathered by the hardships of life and the frontier. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his boots left deep impressions in the dry earth as he walked toward Caleb. "You sure stirred up a hornet's nest, Caleb," Pete said, his voice rough but not unkind. "But you did the right thing, I reckon. Nobody else could have pulled it off." Caleb gave a slow, weary nod. He didn't feel like the man who had done the right thing. The weight of the battle, the lives lost, the soldiers dead, and the Comanche warriors still nursing their wounds. It all sat on his chest like a stone. "You saw what happened here, Pete," Caleb replied, his voice low. "This wasn't just a raid. It was a massacre in the making. And I don't know what comes next. But there's no going back." Pete leaned against a nearby fence post and glanced toward the barn. "No, there ain't. But I reckon we've all got a debt to pay now, Caleb. You mean all of us. The question is, how do we pay it?" Caleb didn't have an answer to that. His gaze wandered over the scattered bodies, the destruction, and the still smoldering remains of the battlefield. His thoughts went to Ayanna, to the chief, and to the future. He'd helped the girl who had once been his enemy, and now he was surrounded by both his people and hers, forced to navigate a world of uncertain allegiances. "You ever think about what it was like before?" Pete asked, his voice soft. "Before all this violence? Before Sarah?" Caleb's breath caught at the mention of his late wife. He turned away, staring into the horizon where the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of red and gold. The land, the air, the wind, it all seemed to speak of Sarah in a way that words could not. "I think about it every damn day, Pete," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every damn day since she died. I promised her I wouldn't let hate fill what was left of me. But after today," he paused, his words trailing off. "I don't know, Pete. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Pete didn't offer words of comfort, just a silent understanding. The two men stood side by side, their gaze fixed on the horizon, each lost in his own thoughts. It was a long time before either of them spoke again. Ayana's a strong girl, Pete said finally, breaking the silence. You're doing right by her. But don't lose yourself in it, Caleb. You can't fix the whole world. You just have to do the best you can. Caleb gave a slow nod. He didn't know what the future held. But as he looked at Pete, at the ranchers, and at the land that had seen so much death, he realized that perhaps the future wasn't about fixing anything. It was about survival, and maybe a little bit of redemption. As the day gave way to night, the ranchers gathered, their silhouettes outlined against the dimming sky. They'd lost men, yes, but they had also gained something: respect. In this harsh, unforgiving land, that was more than most could hope for. Caleb didn't know how long Ayana would stay. She was healing, but time could only tell if the wounds left by her people's past could ever truly heal. But as she sat quietly on the porch, staring out at the setting sun, Caleb couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was a future for them both after all. Not a future without struggle, not a future without pain, but one built on the understanding that sometimes redemption didn't come from changing the world. It came from doing what was right in the moment, no matter the cost. The wind carried dust and regret through the open door, but it also carried something else: hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, peace could be found in the most unlikely of places. The ranch grew quiet in the days that followed the battle. The ranchers had long since returned to their homesteads, their stories of what had transpired at Caleb Thornfield's place traveling faster than the wind itself. Word spread through the small towns about the cavalry, the Comanche warriors, the betrayal, and the strange alliance forged by blood and honor. Some called it a miracle, others a tragedy. But for Caleb, it was nothing more than survival, a fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. Ayana had spent her days recovering, the fever breaking and her body slowly regaining strength. She had learned the ways of the white man's land, how to read English, how to understand the strange language of the treaties that would come to define her future. But it wasn't just Caleb who taught her these things. There is an unspoken bond that grew between them, one not defined by blood, but by the shared hardship they both bore. Caleb had made it clear that his ranch, once a place of solitude and quiet, would now be a place where people could come together, no matter their heritage. It was a bold statement in a time when such things were impossible, when loyalty to one's race and land often meant loyalty to war. But Caleb Thornfield was different. His grief had shaped him into someone who saw the world not as a battleground, but as a place to rebuild, piece by broken piece. He was up early, his boots crunching on the dirt as he walked to the barn to check on the cattle. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the open land. He paused, taking in the beauty of it, the way the sky lit up with hues of lavender and orange, the way the morning air tasted like dust and rain. It was a land that had given him everything and taken so much in return. As he reached the barn, Ayana was already there, her long braids swaying as she tended to the animals. She had become an integral part of the ranch, her sharp eyes catching details Caleb had once missed. He watched her for a moment, noting how she moved with the confidence of someone who had faced death and come out the other side. She turned to him as she worked, offering a quiet smile. "I'm getting used to this," she said, her voice still soft from the fever but stronger now. "I didn't think I'd ever see peace again." Caleb couldn't help but smile back, though it was tinged with sadness. "None of us thought we'd find it out here. But it's here now for what it's worth." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Do you think we'll ever have peace, Caleb? Not just for us, but for all of them. Our people, the settlers, the soldiers." He thought about it for a moment, watching as a hawk circled high above the plains. "I don't know, Ayana. Peace is a fragile thing. It's built one day at a time, one choice at a time." She stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You've already done more than anyone could ever ask. You saved me." Caleb felt the weight of her words, the sincerity behind them. But it wasn't just saving her that mattered. It was the choice he had made, not to turn away, not to stay quiet, but to act. In a world that was still unraveling, sometimes that was the most a man could do. Later that afternoon, the chief rode in, accompanied by a few of his warriors. It was not a visit of war, but of peace. The medicine bag still hung from Caleb's belt, a reminder of the bond between them, forged in the fires of war and violence, but now tempered by something more enduring. The chief dismounted, his eyes scanning the ranch, the land that Caleb had claimed for his own, the land that had once been a battleground. "You have done much for my people, Caleb Thornfield," the chief said, his voice low but filled with respect. "But there is much still to be done." Caleb met his gaze, understanding what was being said without the need for more words. "I know," he said simply, "and I'm ready." Ayanna stood beside him, her presence a silent testament to the changes that had already taken place. The chief nodded toward her, his expression softening. "Your daughter has great strength," he said to Caleb. "She will help bridge the gap between us and the settlers. But she will need guidance. We all do." Caleb looked at Ayanna, who stood proud, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife Caleb had given her. She had become not only a symbol of survival, but of hope. Hope that one day, things could be different. "I'll teach her what I know," Caleb said, his voice steady. "And she'll teach me what I don't." The chief's eyes gleamed with approval. "The world changes, Caleb Thornfield, but it is men like you who make that change happen." The afternoon turned to evening, and the ranchers gathered around a fire to share stories of the battle that had nearly torn them apart. The chief sat with them, not as a leader of warriors, but as a man who had learned, like Caleb, that peace had to be built slowly, piece by piece. The fire crackled as the night air grew cool, and Caleb felt a deep, unspoken gratitude for this moment. This was the peace they had fought not with guns or violence, but with choices. The choice to stand up when everyone else would have walked away. The choice to heal, to forgive, and to look forward instead of backward. It was a fragile peace, yes, and it could break at any moment. But for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt the weight of the past start to lift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something that might last, something that could endure the harsh winds of the frontier. As the fire burned low, Caleb sat back and let the warmth wash over him. In this world of dust and blood, this land of endless sky and rugged stone, there was still room for hope. Some debts aren't paid in gold. They're paid in blood, but some debts, like the ones between men who learn to trust each other, can be paid with something more precious. A second chance. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the ranch where Caleb Thornfield had once found himself a man haunted by grief and a past that never let go. The wind whispered through the dry prairie grass, as if carrying secrets from the land, from the centuries of blood spilled and promises broken. But on this evening, there was no blood, no cries of war. There was only the soft murmur of a world slowly turning, a world that had tasted justice and found a flicker of redemption. Caleb Thornfield, the man who had lost everything, now stood taller than he ever had before. The loss of his wife, Sarah, to Comanche raiders had been a wound that never truly healed, but through his actions, through his choice to save a life instead of ending one, he had found something far more valuable than vengeance. He had found peace. A fragile peace, to be sure, but one that had been hard-won, forged in the fires of battle and the choices made by men of honor, men of pride, men of purpose. Ayanna had recovered from her wounds, though the scars would remain, not just on her body, but in her heart. The time she had spent on Caleb's ranch, learning English, learning about the world she had been born into, was more than just an exchange of languages. It was a new beginning for her, a chance to leave behind the chaos of the past and build something for the future. Caleb had taught her how to read the words of the treaties and the laws that would define the land, and in turn, she taught him how to understand the quiet strength of her people, a strength that came not from fighting, but from survival. When she finally left the ranch, riding back to her father's band with the Comanche chief's blessing, she was not the same girl who had fallen behind the cottonwood tree, bleeding from a bullet wound. She had grown, not just in strength, but in wisdom. She was no longer the helpless girl lost in the wilderness. She was the daughter of a chief, a woman of conviction, a mediator between two worlds that had once been at war with each other. She had a purpose now, a purpose that would carry her far beyond the boundaries of Caleb's ranch, a purpose that would take her into the heart of negotiations and peace-building. The medicine bag that the chief had given Caleb still hung from his belt, a constant reminder of the strange bond that had formed between them, two men from opposite sides of a long-standing conflict. Caleb had once thought that a man could only find peace by running from his past, by shutting out the world that had torn him apart. But now he knew better. He had not just survived, he had built something, a bridge between two worlds that had once been irreconcilable. It was this bridge that would carry Caleb through the years that followed. It was not just a piece of land that he tended, nor the cattle that he managed. It was the people that came to him, Comanche and settler alike, seeking solutions to their problems, looking for a way to coexist in a world where the past had left deep scars. His ranch became a sanctuary of sorts, a neutral ground where men and women who had once been enemies could meet and talk, barter, and share in the labor of survival. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. Caleb had done more than build a ranch. He had built a place of refuge, a place where peace, though fragile, could take root. The land, once stained with the blood of countless battles, was now a place where the future could begin anew. The rifle he had once used to protect his home now hung on the wall as a reminder of a time when survival meant fighting. But it was not the weapon he reached for now. Instead, he reached for the books that Ayanna had left behind, the records of treaties and agreements that would guide the future. He didn't need a gun anymore. He needed knowledge. As Caleb sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, he would often think of Sarah. She was gone, and no amount of time or land could bring her back. But as the wind shifted across the plains, he could almost hear her voice in the rustling grass, feel her presence in the quiet moments when everything seemed still. The grief would never leave him, but it had evolved. It had become something else. It had become a part of him, shaping his actions, defining the man he had become. And then there were the ranchers, those who had once looked at Caleb with suspicion, those who had seen him as nothing more than a threat, an outsider. They came to him now, not as strangers, but as neighbors, not as enemies, but as allies. The truth was that they had seen something in him that they respected, something in the way he had faced the Comanche chief with honor, something in the way he had protected Ayanna despite the cost. He had shown them that there was another way, a way that didn't involve bloodshed, a way that didn't involve the endless cycle of violence and retribution. In the years that followed, as the land around them slowly changed, Caleb became a man known not for his ability to fight, but for his ability to listen, to understand, and to offer a hand when it was needed most. He had learned, as all men must, that the greatest victories were often the quietest ones, the victories that came not from taking life, but from preserving it. The medicine bag still hung from Caleb's belt, and though it had become a symbol of his bond with the Comanche people, it had also become a symbol of his own redemption. It was a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought within, the battles fought against one's own demons, one's own rage, one's own desire for vengeance. And in that quiet moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the wind whispered through the prairie grass, Caleb Thornfield knew that he had done something that mattered. He had not just survived, he had lived. And in living, he had made the world a little less broken, a little less cruel. As for Ayanna, she became more than just a symbol of survival. She became a symbol of hope. She took her father's place as a voice for the Comanche people, using the education Caleb had given her to forge new paths, new understandings between her people and the settlers who had once been their enemies. She became a woman of influence, respected by both the Comanche and the settlers for her wisdom and determination. And in the years to come, when the fires of conflict flared up again, it was Ayanna who stepped in as a mediator, a protector of peace. Caleb, too, continued his life, not as a hero, but as a man who had learned that redemption came in many forms. He had no need for fame, no need for recognition. He had the respect of his neighbors, the friendship of the chief, and the knowledge that, when the world had tried to tear him apart, he had done the right thing. He had saved a life when he could have ended it. He had chosen mercy when he could have chosen revenge. In the end, as Caleb sat on his porch, the wind carrying the sweet smell of rain across the land, he realized that, in a world built on violence and hardship, sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply to hold on. Hold on to the hope that, even in the darkest times, there was a way forward. And sometimes, just sometimes, that way forward was found not through blood and guns, but through understanding and compassion.